Welcome to Turning Pages, a series of in-depth conversations with authors about their works.
All right, well, her novel, The Spectacle, set in the art world, Anna Barrington joins me on the program to discuss it. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Michael.
So you yourself were part of the art world, and so I'm curious, like, not to say that you're Ingrid, but how much of Ingrid's kind of foray into the world of art is drawn on your own experience?
Interesting question. I think a lot of people have tried to ask me this, but this is sort of the most blunt way in. Um, I really drew on my own experience for both characters a lot. Yeah, I think in some ways even more so for Rudolph. Um, I drew for both. Um, with Ingrid, she is a failed artist. That isn't my experience, but I understood the frustration of really wanting to succeed in something creative because the entire time I was working in the art world, in galleries and auction houses, um, I wanted to be a writer, so I felt that stifled frustration. And I at the same time knew many people who had tried to be artists, but they couldn't make it work. And so they found themselves working in the art world on the other side. So I wanted to explore that sort of like Schadenfreude feeling, which I think a lot of people identify with because they want to do something creative, but then they can't make the money. So they find themselves in a business that is sort of tangentially associated with it.
Right. Well, I apologize for being blunt. I didn't want to start things
No,
off
it's okay.
quite with that tone. I just was curious because, as I understood it, you'd worked in galleries, and so it's
Yeah,
interesting to
yeah,
hear you
totally.
say, Rudolph. You wrote yourself
Yeah,
into
no,
Rudolph as
it's a
well.
good question. I mean, it's funny.
So then, like having worked in galleries, it's funny. I happened to read a thing you wrote for Writer's Digest,
Oh,
a
cool.
little blurb about being a reader, but also about kind of like having your antenna up. And so I'm curious about, you know, when you were in specific situations, like you said, you work tangential to kind of being a creative in some sense within these art galleries. Is that something you were kind of honed in on in terms of interactions and things like that, and mining those interactions for a book like this? Or were you not conscious of that as you were going through it, and it was only when you started kind of hitting on this story that you went back into kind of what you'd experienced?
Um, that's a good question. I think, well, I always wanted to write a book, and I think on a certain level, was always, even in the very first days of getting an internship, I was thinking part of this is going to be just like a material collecting exercise, almost like a method acting thing, even though I was very interested in art. I really loved it. But I guess I often just I'm such an observer that part of me always thinks, okay, I'm entering as this social setting as like a method acting exercise. And what I'm doing is collecting material. So I knew that, and I was like recording everything all the time. Um, Even though on another level I was having fun and everything. So yeah, I guess does that answer the question?
Yes, and I guess it maybe kind of suggests why you said you're Rudolph as well, because there's like a method acting
Yeah.
kind of perspective to him. Like he's in a situation, but acting in kind of a, I don't want to say a soulless way, but like a performative way.
Totally. I think that's how I could really understand him because although my aim is not to create a Ponzi scheme, I can understand how people feel like actors in their own lives and how they can use that as a sort of talent.
So did Rudolph or Ingrid come first in terms of like as a character?
So I came up with Ingrid, her personality, because it was in a lot of ways just mine. If I didn't have a creative outlet, or if I felt like my creative outlet had been totally stopped. I started writing things down about my petty frustrations as I struggled to get jobs in the art world. But there was nothing really threading them together. They were just sort of your average, 22-year-old rants. And so then I was like, but there are so many really interesting things about the art world. I want to explore kind of the opaque workings of these financial dealings and the artists and everything. But I need to put a plot around it to make it, commercial, because I knew how hard it was to get published. So at that point, I decided to hook it on a sort of tabloid story, and I did.
Yeah. So there is a lot about the art world to kind of unpack here. And I was curious, like, did you kind of itemize the things that you wanted to address about the art world, or did you find that like plot mechanics allowed you to hit on certain things at different times without kind of creating a laundry list?
There were definitely it unfolded surprisingly naturally. Um, yeah, there were things like that just kind of kept cropping up. Like I would roughly outline like, so, I knew there was going to be the scam, and I knew that at a certain point he had to be running away from the law. But in other ways, like with their relationship and the sort of actual events of um, the loss of his business and so on, those things were up to me. Um, and they were kind of just decided by what was happening in my own work life. I drew a lot, I fictionalized a lot.
When you say you drew on your work, like in the galleries.
Yes.
So speaking of the galleries, one of early on, Ingrid's reflecting on the galleries and kind of their space and there's like the unwashed kind of like looking through the windows at like a specific gallery opening and stuff. And there's a lot to say about kind of like class and money. And how conscious were you of that while you were working at the gallery versus kind of writing about the gallery afterwards?
Oh, that's interesting. I was very, very, very conscious, and I think it's impossible not to work in the art world and be totally conscious of it, because galleries and auction houses, what they're really selling is status. This is made clear in 1,000 different ways. So the being an arbiter of class, being an arbiter of status, merchandising and advertising class and status, that basically was the art world, at least on the side of the sales, not necessarily the artists. So it was something I thought about all the time. And I thought about it especially, in relation to like how successful it was, because when you're spending that level of money, it's no longer about utility. It means many things. I think like as religion shifts out of importance in our culture, art performs a spiritual function. But more than that, and it depends on who you are. It also represents your taste, and taste is the sign of a high social class. To have great taste is to demarcate yourself as a sort of aristocrat of society.
Yeah, there's much made of like when Rudolph is trying to woo prospective clients of like the value attached to these things and not just the art itself. And I was curious like how much that is ripped from your own experience and kind of viewing how the art world behaves and whether like because this is something like people have an inherent I think taste in certain things and then are maybe coached to appreciate other things or because there's status attached to it glom onto or find something attractive that they maybe wouldn't necessarily.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I thought of Rudolph as like his main function, his niche in the art world is being the kind of guy who coaches, kind of tech bros, or people who have recently acquired a lot of money to go to the next stage. They have suddenly leisure time and they want to be perceived as like being part of the upper class. There were a lot of people like this in my experience. Um, and that itself is kind of like an interesting literary thing to examine, which goes back to James and so much earlier to me. But he's that kind of guy, who's like, oh, I'll show you the ropes.
Yeah, because there seems to be kind of like, especially with the tech bro thing, like that nouveau riche, and then like kind of taste and like kind of being established amongst some like older, wealthier, artistic kind of people versus like the people who want to buy their way in. And
Yeah.
it weirdly enough, and I know I've seen these comparisons that like Bret Easton Ellis's American Psycho, that like Rudolph has been compared to Patrick Bateman. But to me, it's like the Bateman character, is finding like pleasure in the nouveau riche thing, whereas Rudolph, I think, has modeled himself as someone who would have like bristled at Patrick Bateman's tastes.
Yeah. I think Rudolph is very self-conscious. Yeah. Um, I guess you're right. At the same time, he feels a sort of pride, I think, in having made his own money, and um, he sort of is an uneasy balance between the two.
Yeah, I'm just thinking like he would not have praised Huey Lewis in the News or something. Like he would have found that way too normcore and just like maybe not to his style, or at least to the style he was projecting as having. And I guess maybe that gets us the sense of like
Yeah, I guess, yeah, that totally makes sense. I mean, he is the one trying to lead around the Patrick Batemans and be like, "Oh no, you think you're cool? See much how cooler you can be."
yeah, like the Bateman is much more like the nephew of the two German buyers of the Belisaire, right? Like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
That said, he is kind of a cipher, or like he presents as kind of tries to present as a blank slate at times, and that's one thing that I found interesting is it kind of in the relationship between Rudolph and Ingrid is like she feels empty and feels that like his love would fill her up, and he feels empty and he feels that money would fill him up, and then they're both kind of struggling with feeling like imposters. Was it purposeful to give them both kind of like this hollowness?
Um, I guess I think so, yeah. I mean, they are both kind of void-like, and I think that void is a reflection of the society they're in. I think it reflects a lot of people that I know, especially who, they're always seeking something, but even when they get that thing, it doesn't quite um, fulfill everything to them. I think that's somewhat natural. So I guess I was trying to reflect that, but also show how they're part of this world, which itself is hollow.
Right. So you said, obviously the society they're in. This book is set at a very specific time in American history. And I'm curious about kind of how much thought you gave to like when exactly this takes place in the real world. Because obviously there's fictional artists and stuff, but there are real artists and there is, real world happenings that this is tied to.
Totally. I mean, the auction in which they sell the Da Vinci was real. And I had to make sure that all of the art in it was fake. Otherwise it would be too close. But yeah, I wanted to make it real. Someone once told me, like pretty recently, that she felt like it was a Technicolor version of like the real world, which rings true to me. I sort of wanted to create something that would be like a hyper real crystal ball period piece of this period that we have just lived through. Um, Recognizable, but at the same time different. And I wanted to set it during that period because Trump had just got elected, and I just found I, some of this was just, kind of my naivete entering the art world as a newly graduated student. Um, but I was just really shocked by the insanely high prices that art sold for and who was buying it and sort of the discourse around it that was really emphasizing how everything was going to change the world. It was about climate change, it was about social justice, it was about this, it was curing cancer. Um, and from a marketing perspective, like it makes the artist seem important, everything. The artists also wanted to protest Trump, so that's another thing. But it just seemed to me like the extreme dissonance between what this art was being marketed as, um, versus the tiny fraction of people who were seeing it and buying it for these insane prices was reflective of another massive gap that was happening in the country at the time, which was the gap in understanding between the people who were voting the president into power, versus the liberal elite who was sitting on the museum boards and all of those people whom I knew well.
That yeah, at one point I think you write about, every price is the collective belief in an arbitrary fiction when it comes to the art world. But that, to me, that spoke to a larger thing about like the arbitrary fiction of, politics, of society, that like in some way it's all built on a scam.
Totally, yeah. And I mean, I feel like I said that with some judgment, but like, you know, I really identified with those artists. I really believed much the same as what they believe, but I guess I didn't believe that the art was going to do all those things at the same time. Um, or that it was even made for, for the common good rather than a small subsection of billionaires. But yeah, it was, I sort of wanted to analyze like how that fictionality in our society became so dominant and just like the major narrative. And to me, it felt like 2016.
So, did that present any problems setting it at that period, like for you as a writer to kind of recreate that period, or
No,
specifying a thing, was that like a something that you could, like a tent peg that you could bind things to?
it actually was no problem at all. I, I mean, I don't think the characters like overtly, um, get super concerned with the timelines of anything, except for, the book begins with Trump's election. But other than that, no. And yeah, so 2016, 2017 is a good time because, people are mostly the same in terms of like dress, everything.
Oh, meaning like things haven't changed so drastically to now in terms of like, technologies or things like that that you couldn't.
Yeah.
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 The things that like the kind of larger ideas that you wanted to address, did you allow the plot to kind of like telegraph those things, or like did you have to kind of like intellectually like backload some of that stuff in after the first draft, or like I'm curious about process and kind of how you kind of make sure you're kind of hitting what you want to hit.
Interesting. Yeah, that's such a good question. It's something that definitely I mean, when I set out to write this book, I had zero literary ambitions. I was just like, I didn't trust myself to write a sophisticated work, I think, even though I had read a lot. Um, so I was just sort of writing really, really fast and a lot of the early drafts were very much just zero ideas, a lot of dialogue, a lot of sort of brand names. And then as I started reworking it, because I intensely rewrite everything, I will rewrite things like 30, 50 times. Um, then I sort of started seeing some of the things, and I think what really mattered was, as part of my job, I had to interview artists all the time, and they would talk to me about their ideas. And they would talk to me about how their ideas got into their paintings and what they were reading. And so it was just really kind of informative and profound for a 25-year-old to be hearing all this from people older than me, and wiser in the ways of how creative process could help. And that's when I sort of started to realize that everything I digested intellectually would make its way into my book. And so I would finesse things. But I've tried not to make anything like overtly symbolic because I hate that.
Right. Allow the plot to kind of dictate or suggest what you're getting at and not get pedantic.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think the most important thing is what the reader takes away from it. But um, it's always a difficult question, isn't it? How much to show.
You mentioned that, obviously this is for a book, but you were a big reader, and that was something that I noted in the piece that you did for Writer's Digest, that you said, read like 2 to 4 hours a day. And I'm curious, like how an expansive a reader, how purposeful a reader are you?
I'm pretty expansive and purposeful, I'd say. Um, my parents have an incredible collection of books. They must have like 2,000 books in their house. So I used to always just read and pick stuff up. Now I'm more purposeful. I try to, like, I'm working on a second book now, so I'm trying to sort of like find everything that might even possibly be related to any subject. And that is more with this book, how I'm trying to find the plot. Like, let the research guide me into what is the plot, if
Yeah.
that makes sense at all.
Yeah, no, for sure. You'd also written a piece for She Reads about art novels, art world novels. Five suggested art world novels. Like, had you been reading art world novels with an eye to the fact that this was going to be your book, or is that just a twist of fate that you happen to read a lot about that world?
Kind of twist of fate. I really like art criticism. I remember reading like a lot of Barth in college, and Bernard Berenson, some of the symbolist poets. Proust wrote some good art criticism, but I never really read art novels. That's bad to admit.
You the the forward, you have a Guy Debord quote, and
Yes.
so did the spectacle, the title, come from that quote, or did you find that quote after you decided this was the title?
I was thinking about it for a while. I had another title at first, which is so bad that I can't say it aloud. Um, but I then, maybe midway through writing the book, I started reading that text, and it just came to me as really perfect for sort of summarizing that materialist society, which the protagonists feel caught up in.
Yeah, obviously the quote is the spectacle is the flip side of money, and it's from the Society of the Spectacle, a Debord quote. And obviously, I mean, it really does speak to kind of what this book is about. It just seems perfectly attuned to kind of like the vibrations of this book, and the like wrestling with the money and the visual of the art world. And I was curious, like, did you hesitate at all about starting a book off with something that was so kind of transparent?
Um, hmm, I didn't, but maybe that's just because I have a lot to learn. I don't know.
It just is maybe like a magician showing the trick before they even start the show kind of thing. But it's fascinating because I didn't. The advanced copy that I got didn't have the acknowledgments, and I always love to read the acknowledgments, and I like to see the forward because sometimes there are hints as to kind of like where your head was at in the process, which is something I'm fascinated with, and this seemed to be like, wow, after reading the book, thinking back on that being the thing that it really is kind of like right there at the beginning.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I only really chose that after I had finished writing, the first few drafts. But yeah, I think there's a whole section of readers who are just reading it as a straight up thriller. And that's fine. But I guess I also wanted to show those who aren't that I'm thinking about other stuff as well.
Yeah. Okay. So that I mean, maybe I didn't see it pitched as a thriller to start with, so I kind of really saw it as like a cultural critique of class and money and the art world and wrestling with kind of like the people that are involved with art who don't make money from the art and that kind of thing.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, that's a perfect way to read it. That's so flattering to me.
So if it is pitched as a thriller to other folks, like are they kind of like on a surface level kind of getting at what you're putting out there as far as art and consumption and artifice?
I think a lot of them are, which is kind of surprising to me, but reassuring. I think there are a lot of different threads in the book that people seem to like. I mean, some people read it and they just see it as a straight up toxic romance. Um, and that's fine. I want people to identify with the book, um, as they want to, I guess, and I hope it speaks to a lot of different swaths. But I feel very touched at the same time when someone like you really picks up on exactly what I was trying to write.
I guess as an author, you kind of at a certain point have to just like let the book exist, and when readers come to it and how they approach it, you don't have any control over.
Yeah, exactly. Um, but yeah, I think it's difficult because the reading public is so different to the way it was, 100 years ago. Um, so yeah, you just never know who is going to pick up the book and how different their lives might be.
Well, for folks who want to figure out what the world is about at the time that they read it, Union Square and Company's the publisher. It is out now. Anna Barrington, thanks very much for joining me and talking about the spectacle. Congratulations on the release.
Thanks so much, Michael.